I am doing this video to tell you the story of my life, for my grandchildren and hopefully my great-grandchildren. There wouldn't be a story without my parents. My father, Frank Rayner, was born in 1929, the start of the Great Depression, so he was born into hard times. He was the second child of Bill and Lily Rayner. He had an older brother, Bill, and he had two younger sisters, Fran and Betty. My father's family came from 3 generations of police. My great-grandfather was the chief of police in North Bay, Ontario. And my grandfather tells an interesting story that one day his father took him aside and said, "Bill, this town isn't big enough for the both of us, and I'm not leaving." So my grandfather headed west. And he made it to Regina, Saskatchewan, where he joined the RCMP. And he stayed with the RCMP until he met my grandmother Lily. And at that time, the RCMP required that you were single for 7 years and then had to get permission to get married. Well, my grandmother was expecting, and it was time to move on. The third to join the police was my father. Interesting fact for my father was that he had actually applied to both the Vancouver City Police and to the fire department. And he wasn't picky. Whoever phoned first was where he was going. The police phoned first. So my father was a Vancouver City policeman for 33 years. My mother, Lorraine Lindorf, was born in the Icelandic settlement of Selkirk, Manitoba. She was the oldest daughter of Anna and Dan Lindorf. She had 1 brother, Bud, and 2 sisters, Shirley and Janice. Her mother, Anna, was the 11th of 12 children of her father, Thorberger, and his 3rd wife. Her mother, Arnfjörður, was an immigrant from Iceland, and she never learned to speak English. It was such a large Icelandic community in the area of Selkirk, Manitoba, that she never had to learn. My grandfather, Dan, was an immigrant from Denmark, came to Canada in his early 20s, worked on the farms, had to learn English because he didn't speak English, and very little is known about his past. He was very secretive about it, and if you asked him what his nationality was, he said he was Canadian. It was the only country that ever did anything for him. My mom and dad met in Steveston in 1948. Mom was only 15 and dad was 18. That same year, Mom's family moved to the farm in Port Coquitlam, but that didn't stop them from seeing each other. Dad spent the next 3 years driving 2 hours on dirt roads out to the farm to see Mom. It was so far that he would spend the night with Mom's brother, Bud, and leave the next day. But he was expected to work on the farm. He paid for those dinners and breakfasts. In 1951, Mom and Dad married at the farm, and in 1953, they had my brother Frank Jr. In 1956, they had me. They were living in Richmond at the time, and the closest hospital was St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver. So Dad drove to St. Paul's, dropped Mom off in the hospital, went to park the car, and when he came back in, I was there. Mom said I was almost born in the elevator. My parents took me home to the house that they were building in Richmond. They were building that house room by room from paycheck to paycheck. And my father surprised my mom by having my room ready when they brought me home from the hospital. I had a great childhood. Family was a big part of our life, and we were all living in quite close proximity. I had cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents, and we got together frequently, and it was a good time. We were one of the more privileged families. Dad had a good job. There was only 2 of us in the family, and we took vacations. We went to Disneyland. We went boating and water skiing and camping. Other kids in our neighborhood were from larger families or poorer families and didn't have the advantages that we did. We felt very, very lucky. My best friend Ruthie was same age as me and the same grade as me, and she was from a larger family. They never took vacations, and often Mom and Dad would let her come with me, so I had a playmate. Ruthie and I went to Tom Set School together. It was a small 4-room school, And it only had 2 teachers, and there was only enough students for 2 grades going at the same time. We had a grade 1 and 2 and a grade 3 and 4. So it was a very small, close-knit school, had great friends. When I was in grade 5, I had the misfortune of breaking my leg when I was skiing down Grouse Mountain. Total break, cast up to the top of my thigh for a month, cast to the bottom of my knee for a month, and then crutches for 2 weeks. Well, Mom and Dad didn't have 2 cars, so if Dad was working, Mom would order me a taxi to get me home. That was something, especially to my friends who got to ride with me in the taxi on the way home. Talk about being popular. In grade 6, we moved. Mom and Dad were building a new house in Port Coquitlam, and they wanted me to start the school year in Port Coquitlam so I didn't have to change school halfway. Big bonus on this, I got to live with Amma. Amma lived 2 blocks from the school that I was going to be going to. I was not in a hurry for my parents to finish that house. And eventually they did finish it, and we moved in there. But yeah, I had a real great couple of months before then. When my brother Frank was 16 years old, he decided to run away from home. I thought that was a great idea. As a matter of fact, I packed his bags and I gave him every penny I had, which was probably all of $5. Didn't care. It was gas money for him and he was leaving. So Frank made it as far as Kelowna, and he got caught siphoning gas out of a truck compound. The police arrested him and they took him back to the police station, and they phoned my parents and they said, well, we won't be charging him if you come here and get him. So they weren't going to release him on his own, especially since he was only 16 and he had no money. So my mom said to my father, Marcy is going with you so that you don't kill him on the way home. It was my first plane ride ever. We flew to Kelowna and we had a very quiet drive home. I met Bill Perfett when I was 15 years old and he was 16. At that time, I decided he was no longer in school, and I decided to quit school too. Not a good choice. I did get a job, however. I got a job at the UIC office in New Westminster. Paid a whopping $2 an hour. Lucky for me, Mom and Dad let me live at home and didn't charge me room and board. And in the meantime, Bill, also realizing he needed an education, had applied to a trade school to be a heavy-duty mechanic. He got accepted. Only drawback, the trade school was in Dawson Creek. So we decided in all our wisdom, yep, we were 16 and 17, that we were moving to Dawson Creek. So we went and said to my mom and dad that we were going, and it was up to them whether we went married or not. Well, 6 weeks later, I was married. It was on Mom and Dad's anniversary, the 21st of April, and we moved to Dawson Creek. Interesting experience in Dawson Creek is that I drove in snow for the first time. It snowed on the 16th of August, and I had to drive because Bill had hurt himself and he was in the hospital in Dawson Creek. We only had to stay there till September. It was a 6-month course. And when we moved back to the Lower Mainland, we moved in behind Bill's parents. Bill Sr. had renovated a garage for us to move into, and no point in my going back to work because I was expecting April. April was born, and we brought her back to that little garage. And the good thing about living behind the Perfetts is that Ethel would come down every night and take her April up to the house for an hour. And it was a nice break for me, and they were very fond of April. I moved out on May 1st of 1975. I was 19 years old, and yes, everyone told me it wouldn't work, and yes, they were right. Not that I said that they were, but it was time. And I had learned a valuable lesson. Time to go back to school. If I wanted to make more than $2 an hour, I needed an education. Went back to Centennial High School, got the major subjects that I needed completed, and to finish off my schooling, I wrote the GED exam, and I was granted my grade 12 equivalency. I also started a criminology course. I thought that was the direction I was going. It was like it was in my blood. I was going to try for the police force. I didn't complete attending college for my criminology course because I was offered a job at Vancouver City Police. Dad told me about the 911 position that had come open. They had opened the 911 center 6 months before and they were in need of extra staff. So I asked Dad, what are the qualifications? And he very quickly said, well, can you talk on a phone and do you speak English? Well, that was the job to me. I certainly had the qualifications. So you start Vancouver Police as a complaint taker with all of 2 days training. And because it was the main 911 center and the only 911 center, you actually answered for police, fire, and ambulance. If it was a police call, you took the call. If it was fire or ambulance, you transferred it on down. So I stayed at VPD for 3 years. While I was at work, April went and lived with Mom and Dad, and she came home on my days off. Well, just before she was starting school, I decided to change to Coquitlam. It was a lot closer for me. It was 12-hour shifts, but it meant I had 4 days off. And that made for a much better lifestyle for us. So I did change. I must have liked the job because I stayed as a dispatcher for exactly 30 years in total. Really the only job other than UIC that I ever had. While growing up, I had helped Mom and Dad work on renovations. It was a pastime that Mom and Dad had started shortly after moving to Port Coquitlam. They started renovating houses and renting them out. And I was interested in helping. I liked the carpenter work, and I was kind of like the son that my dad didn't have. My brother was mechanically inclined, and I liked carpentry. So I learned a lot about building houses. And by the time I was 25, Mom and Dad said, why don't we build you a house? First, I thought, way too much responsibility, owning a house, no. But they talked me into it. They had a lot that I could subdivide, and I was living in the house that was on that lot. So that's what we did. Spent the next 3 years building that house. Partly because in the 80s, the interest rate spike went up to 22, 23%, and I actually had to stop building. I couldn't afford to continue. I had paid cash for most of what I had built on, and I didn't have to pay Mom and Dad for the lot until later. So we stopped for a while, and during that stoppage, I met a gentleman at work. He came to work at our office as the first victim services counselor, and his name was Bob Slocum. And he was newly separated. Well, Bob and I got together and we moved into the house when it was finished together. He had 3 children, one daughter the same age as April, a son, and then a little girl. And about 9 months later, we had Robert Franklin Slocum Jr. Later changed his name to Rayner. After I left home, Mom and Dad started searching for a recreation property. Their thoughts turned to the Gulf Islands, in particular because they could travel on the ferry and Dad could sleep after shift and not have to drive all night. If they bought a place up country, they said there was too much driving involved. So they started searching the different Gulf Islands, and they checked out an ad for Saturna Island that said gentle slope to beach. And they met with the owner, Cliff Sacker. And Cliff actually said he was interviewing them because he lived next door to the lot that was for sale, and he wanted to make sure he was getting good neighbors. So Dad and him got along very well. They both shared a bit of a love of a drink in the evening, and Mom and Dad bought the beach. While they were building, Dad would be walking up and down the said gentle slope to beach and many a time remarked that it definitely wasn't. So we had a lot of family time there. Saturna Island has a July 1st lamb barbecue, and a lot of us would go there. And there were lots of things for the kids to do. There was salmon fishing, clam digging, oysters, boating and barbecues. And Saturna Island became really a focal point for the family. When the kids were younger, they had the privilege of going with their grandparents before they started school or on weekends, and I was actually very envious I didn't get to go near as much as they did. I guess that's how come my parents made up for it by leaving Saturna Island to me in trust for my kids and their kids. So my marital life changed a little bit. Bob and I broke up, and I was, again, a single parent with a 4-month-old and a 9-year-old. And the next 7 years were pretty much filled up with April's horse shows and Robert's sports. April was a great equestrian, had a great love of horses, and her grandfather Rainer bought her a horse when she was 14 years old called Struck Me. It was the start of a very long equestrian relationship for her. Robert started out in baseball. That was my favorite sport. I taught him to hit a ball when he was 3 years old. Unfortunately, I didn't know Robert was left-handed. Consequently, to this day, Robert bats right and catches left. Oops, one of those parents' moments. April brought a gentleman home one evening. She had been at the hospital visiting her boyfriend. And the boyfriend's father said, "You're not taking the bus home at 10 o'clock at night. We'll drive you." So Jim folks drove April home, and to April's surprise, I had returned from vacation early. And she, not knowing what else to do, invited Jim in for a cup of tea. He stayed for 5 years. Jim and I lived together in the Port Coquitlam house for a very short time, and we sold our respective houses and we moved to Langley. And we lived in our Langley house together for 5 years. Not terribly eventful, blended family of 5 children, 3 of them adults, 2 of them still at home. And it was a peaceful time for some of it. Jim and I ended up parting after 5 years. He then married his childhood sweetheart, and I moved about 6 blocks up the road to a house on a small acreage so that Robert could stay in his school district. I was at that house for a couple of years. Robert started high school, and my parents were really helping out. Rob was too old for a babysitter and too young to be left home alone. And Mom and Dad couldn't be driving out every other week to spend the nights with him. So the decision was made I would rent out that house and I would move to Poco. They had a rental house, and I had them evict the tenants, which wasn't a bad thing. Apparently they were doing something they shouldn't have in the house. Dad and I renovated the house upstairs, new cupboards, and made it quite nice. And my grandmother moved into the basement. She was getting on in years, and she was getting afraid to live by herself. Her favorite dog, the Rottweiler, had passed on, and it was time for her to be with other family. And it was definitely time. She was in her 90s. I stayed there for 4 years, and I had to move back to my home in Langley. And it was time. It was the first time I had ever lived on my own. Started doing strange things like, taking a vacation. Went to Hawaii with some girlfriends. And I was enjoying it. When you're in your 40s and you've never lived on your own, you've either had spouses or children with you, it was time. And then one day I got a phone call, and I got a phone call from Jim. We had been apart for 9 years. It hadn't been a good breakup. He had been married and divorced, and I was a little surprised to get that phone call from him. He was inviting me to the Hillcrest Drive-In. Apparently the Hillcrest Drive-In was closing. He knew this because he was doing some work for the owner. Well, I couldn't make that movie date, and finally did get out of him that it was a date. And then he offered to make me dinner. The man who couldn't boil water asked me out for dinner, and he was going to make it. That was the big catch. So I went to his place for dinner, and he cooked a lovely dinner. Appetizer, salad, steak. Yep, it was a lead on because he never cooked another dinner, but it got us back together. So Jim and I did a repeat. We sold each of our respective homes and we bought another home together. We've enjoyed a lot of traveling. We did my first cruise, at least. I think it was his second. On my 50th birthday, Jim took me on a cruise to the Panama Canal. We've since done 3 cruises up to Alaska. It is absolutely our favorite resting holiday. We're hoping one time to do cruises with the grandkids up there. It's just a great relaxing trip. And we did a cruise around South America for 46 days. It was a trip of a lifetime and ended up in New York. That was fabulous. And our family has grown. Our blended family of 5 expanded with spouses to 10 and expanded with children by 10 going on 11. So our 5 are now 21. So starting from oldest to youngest, we have Jim's oldest son, Jamie, his wife, Wendy, and sons Cameron and Gregory. We have Jim's second oldest, John, his beautiful wife, Luana. She's Brazilian, and they have 2 little girls, Sophia, who's 4 now, and Katerina, and she's 2.5. And the next child in line is April, and she is with Jonathan and their delightful boy, Ryder, and little Lena. And then we have Daniel, and Daniel is married to Nicole, and they have 2 boys, Nathan, 9, and Marcus, 7. And last, the baby of the bunch, who's going to expand the most, Rob married his wife, Sheena. Sheena has a boy, 9, Jaden. Robert has a boy, 7, Jackson. And they are expecting little baby girl, Tennessee, in May. That's our family.